Howdy, everybody. Thank you for this wonderful event and for this opportunity to argue that without metabolic health, talking about sustainable development and sustainability writ large is a hopeless exercise. By way of introduction, I'm trained as a forage agronomist, as a ruminant nutritionist. I've worked in forage agriculture at university and in private industry for most of my adult life. I currently work for a forage seed company. And I've become an advocate for therapeutic carbohydrate reduction and for ruminant animal agriculture and the role of ruminant animal products in human health and flourishing. Like many of us, I've had my own personal health journey. And in that journey, thanks to many people it's been my pleasure to get to know, I've reversed prediabetes, obesity, and remain free and healthy today. And since 2010, I've been speaking on topics that are part of a greater topic, which I call grass-based health. That is, that healthy soils, healthy plants, healthy animals, and healthy people are all interrelated, and that ruminant animal agriculture, forage agriculture plays a fundamental role in all of these spheres. As a result of my activity in this space, I've been given the title of Don Pedro, the sod father of the Ruminati. The invitation is open for new membership in the Ruminati herd, regardless of what your area of expertise is. We need to build bridges. And for several years now, I've been fortunate enough to be attending and participating in events like this one, where I get to learn from practitioners and researchers in the various disciplines related to metabolic health and human nutrition. And I've been trying to bring a message regarding ruminant animal agriculture, because the good news is that we can have healthy people and healthy soils thanks to ruminant animal agriculture. But this isn't an idea original or new to me. This is an idea that goes back many, many decades, and I've been taught by people who were taught by people who were working in this space. And so here's a quote from the 7th International Grasslands Congress in 1956, the year I was born. Grasslands of the world stand twixt a world of plenty and a world of famine, between a land surface of green oases and a land of desert, between surface soil stability and accelerated erosion. And today we have people who are arguing somehow that the production and consumption of animal source food is incompatible with sustainable development. This notion, charitably expressed, is flawed. In fact, we cannot have sustainable food systems without livestock agriculture in general and ruminant animal agricultural systems in particular. It was a great honor to be able to present this presentation to the 24th International Grassland Congress in Kenya. I only wish I could have done it in person. We need a ruminant revolution if we're going to meet the goals of 2050 so that we can enable sustainable development globally. So the fundamental truth is that if we're going to meet today's needs, let alone the needs of 2050 and beyond, we must develop ways to better integrate livestock and cropping systems so that we can produce more food from the same land with the same or lower inputs while protecting our natural resources, especially soil health. We're dealing with systems that are not only more complex than we can think, they may in fact be more complex than we can think. Unfortunately, we have very myopic conversations about this issue called sustainable food production, sustainable beef production, sustainable food systems, sustainable development. All of these are incredibly wicked problems. They are far too complex for us to confidently address a single issue and expect to come up with any concrete improvement. And in fact, if we only focus on one issue like greenhouse gases, we may in fact create a less sustainable system as a result. In addition, we have people who are playing games with words, either intentionally or unintentionally. Unfortunately, this confuses our conversations, and we really need to make sure that when we are using words and phrases that we understand what everyone means by them. Another fundamental fact is that the global burden of non-communicable diseases is unsustainable. The vast majority of deaths globally are due to these non-communicable diseases, or some might think of them as chronic diseases, and that insulin resistance and hyperinsulinemia are at least aggravating, if not causal factors in many, if not most of these conditions. This is global in scope. Half of adults in China, India, and the United States have insulin resistance, hyperinsulinemia, but 80% live in low and middle income countries. Most don't know that they're afflicted. 150% increase is projected in type 2 diabetes by 2030. And too many people involved in sustainable development, sustainable consumption conversations still believe that obesity is the cause of these conditions, not a symptom of them. A specific goal that's been set is a reduction by 1/3 of the premature mortality from non-communicable diseases. This is the percent of 30-year-old people who will die before their 70th birthday due to these diseases. And we can see how they are distributed across the globe. We in this community might very well suggest that there's an approach that should be tried, and yet the therapeutic carbohydrate reduction has not entered into their considerations or discussions. Malnutrition today, we still have far too many people who suffer from caloric deficit, but almost three times as many are overweight and obese. But it's important for us to help people understand that undernutrition is not synonymous with caloric deficit, that it's possible for people to be overfed yet undernourished. And the challenge of protein energy malnutrition is large, especially in children. In addition, people eating diets low in animal source foods typically suffer from low intakes of bioavailable iron, zinc, calcium, retinol, B12, B6, and B12. Half of children under 5 years old are deficient in iron, vitamin A, and zinc. And nearly a quarter of them are stunted, 7% are wasted, 6% are overweight. A third of women of childbearing age are anemic. Vitamin B12 deficiency is widespread. Only 40% of infants less than 6 months are exclusively breastfed. And animal source foods are recognized as the best sources for high quality nutrients for children 6 to 23 months of age, yet 59% of those children are not fed eggs, dairy, fish, or meat. And while there are goals specific to reducing stunting, wasting, and childhood overweight, a perspective informed by metabolic health, therapeutic carbohydrate reduction is not present in their planning and action, let alone a better understanding of amino acid nutrition. If it's not safe, it's not food. There are many issues around food safety that need to be addressed. One that's not well recognized is that grains and nuts that are not properly stored can frequently have aflatoxin, which itself can produce impairments in micronutrient metabolism as well as stunting. Here's an example of why we need to be certain we understand what other people mean by phrases that we think we know or understand. So the dietary guidelines for 2020 to 2025 emphasizes nutrient dense and nutrient density, which seems reasonable, except when you look at what they mean by that definition, they are explicitly saying that fat is not a nutrient, that fat only dilutes essential nutrients, that these foods that are fat-free, low-fat, lean, and without saturated fat are the nutrient-dense foods. And it's by this kind of tortured thinking that you can come to the point where you believe, as they do, that plain shredded wheat is nutrient dense while frosted shredded wheat is not, that vegetable oil is nutrient dense while butter is not, and that while we would agree soda is not nutrient dense, I think we'd argue that sparkling water isn't either. We need to get people to understand that isocaloric quantities from plants and animals are not isometabolic. But similarly, we need to make sure we understand, as well as others, that isometric quantities of protein and minerals from animal source foods and plant source foods are not isometabolic. That in fact, vitamin requirement is dependent upon the source. So to simplify, many sustainable food production conversations focus on caloric yield per acre. And I would merely say, is that the best metric? If we look at sugarcane, for example, we can produce a heck of a lot of calories per hectare, but is that the best form of those calories? I've given a talk elsewhere on the difference between crude protein and true protein and indispensable digestible amino acids. The importance of this, perhaps at an absurd example, is where we had milk that was being diluted in one market and then spiking that diluted milk with melamine and to raise its crude protein content to where it was expected to be, and then selling that into the market. And the problem is that melamine is toxic. This also was used in pet food that came to the United States and was equally toxic to the pets that were fed. But perhaps you might think that that's absurd, but maybe not when we look at many of the global food system conversations where people actually will argue that protein is not a nutrient of concern because they can look at crude protein supply and intake and say, well, even in these 100 and some odd developing countries and territories, crude protein intake, it meets requirement. Oh, there's many problems with this, but not the least of which is that when you begin to correct for protein quality and then the utilizability of that protein, we find that none of those are now meeting what is this arguably too low target. It's not just in low and middle income countries. Our dietary guidelines in the United States use something called ounce equivalents, which have been shown to not be metabolically equivalent in young, healthy individuals, to say nothing of young children or seniors. And to take it back to the most common conversation about sustainability, focusing only on environmental footprints, that is greenhouse gas emissions, When we correct for the essential nutrient content of the foods produced, we find that the impacts become quite comparable between animal source food and plant source food production. Because we need to remember that we're not only obtaining essential amino acids, we're obtaining essential nutrients of other forms that are limiting in some of these other foodstuffs. And then we also need to acknowledge and incorporate the fact that the way we've been expressing the global warming potential of methane from ruminant animals has been overestimating its impact by a factor of 3 to 4 times. We've now got studies showing that measurable improvements in cognitive development and scholastic performance have now been documented in school children from modest increases in animal source food in their diets as a supplement to their existing diet. And we now know that to support healthful aging, it's critical that the diet be of high quality. And so as humanity becomes older, on average, this will become more important as well. Just as it's essential to address all of the various factors of sustainability when it comes to food production systems, we ought to acknowledge the same complexity when it comes to healthcare. Healthcare itself has a significant footprint, if you will. And just looking at greenhouse gas emissions, for example, the average American with type 2 diabetes uses pharmaceuticals equal to 2 metric tons of CO2 equivalent per year. One estimate projected that if the average adult American type 2 diabetic could eliminate their medication use, they would reduce their carbon footprint by 29% more than if they shifted from a high meat to a vegan diet. Expanding that further, if all Americans with type 2 diabetes could eliminate their medication use, it would result in a reduction of almost 50 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent, which would be more than the equivalent of taking 10.8 million passenger cars off the road for a year. This represents 4% of the registered passenger vehicles in the United States, which would be more than 4.7 times the cumulative sales of plug-in electrical vehicles as of December 21. But this would be occurring every single year. I'm calling for all disciplines to work toward bridging the gaps between the various silos of information. We need multidisciplinary investigations and collaborations into what constitutes a healthy diet for the metabolically well as the ill, into the vital role that animal source foods play in human development, health, and flourishing, into the causes of non-communicable diseases, into the essential role that ruminant animal agriculture plays in sustainable food systems, into a science-based assessment of the environmental, societal, and economic impacts of the burdens of non-communicable diseases as well as animal source food production, and a fresh perspective and approach towards communicating this information to the public. One effort that I'm involved in is the 25th International Grasslands Congress in May 2023, whose theme is Grasslands for Soil, Animal, and Human Health. The call for proposals is open. I encourage everyone to submit. Some resources I recommend for people to learn more about many of these topics. Animal Frontiers in October of 2019 was dedicated to foods of animal origin, a prescription for global health. I encourage everyone to read this. When I read it, I noticed how many of the authors still felt compelled to mention the belief that too much animal source food in the diet leads to metabolic illness. DietDoctor.com, we are all familiar with, or should be. The Clear Center at UC Davis is a resource for learning more about animal agriculture and its environmental impacts, as well as efforts to mitigate them. Animal Source Foods in Ethical, Sustainable, and Healthy Diets is a dynamic white paper that's available online, the product of over 24 experts from around the world. And the Society of Metabolic Health Practitioners, again, a resource many of us will be familiar with, but particularly their clinical guidelines for therapeutic carbohydrate restriction is a wonderful resource to introduce people to the literature on the topic. So I hope I've made the case that when you improve your health, you are improving the world. That lowering your burden of metabolic illness will contribute to a global lowering, which will contribute to significant impacts globally. The point is that it may be the most impactful and significant thing that each of us can do as individuals, and then collectively we can have a far greater impact. Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for your attention. I am available if anyone wishes to follow my work or get in touch with me, either to ask questions or if I can be in any way a support to what you're doing. Please don't hesitate to ask. Thank you.